When we think of the idea of Buddhist ethics along the Eightfold Path, perhaps the first thing that comes to mind is right action. It's by acting rightly that we avoid regret and remorse. And by avoiding regret and remorse, the Buddha tells us, we're more able to calm the mind, to reach deep states of meditation, to see clearly the world, and indeed to come to eventual wisdom. This, indeed, is the approach that the Buddha recommends. It all begins with right action, with ethics generally. So what are the aspects of right action for the Buddha? In today's video, I'll be dealing with, as background, Bhante Gunaratana's very good book, 8 Mindful Steps to Happiness. I'm not going to be following his descriptions precisely, but if you want to read more about all this, it's a book that I recommend picking up a copy of. And Bhante Gunaratana calls this skillful action, another way to understand right action. He compares it to the famous 5 precepts that we have in Buddhism. Now, the 5 precepts are slightly different from right action. They're actually broader in scope. Right action only includes 3, at least traditionally, 3 main aspects. That is, not to kill, not to steal, and not to commit sexual misconduct. Those are the 3 major aspects. The 5 precepts include as well the injunction not to lie, which we already saw in the discussion of right speech in my last video. If you haven't seen that, I'll leave a link to it down below in the notes. And also the injunction to avoid intoxicants. Now, the fact that avoiding intoxicants is not part of right action in the Eightfold Path leads some commentators to believe that the reason we're supposed to avoid intoxicants is because intoxicants make us more likely to violate right action, and maybe even right speech as well. So, for example, when we become drunk, we become intoxicated, more likely that we're going to kill, steal, commit sexual misconduct, lie, indulge in harsh speech or divisive speech or idle chatter. These are all the ways that becoming intoxicated may make us behave in unskillful ways. Now, if this is the correct way to understand that, then at least some practitioners believe that it's perfectly okay to have a little bit of alcohol so long as we don't become drunk. It's when we become drunk that we really tend to lose our ability to behave ethically. And others believe that we should avoid alcohol entirely. But in any event, as I say, that's not really directly part of right action. It's simply part of an associated idea of these 5 precepts. So I want to turn now to these 3 major aspects of right action. And all of them, as we'll see, are open to broad interpretation, depending on how we understand them. The first is not to kill. And this may seem the most simple and direct and obvious of the 3, but it's not. I mean, there's a lot of nuance here. One example of that nuance is that in many schools, not all, but many schools of the Mahayana, it's taken to imply vegetarianism because killing animals is implicated in the eating of meat, obviously. However, also true that the Buddha himself was not a vegetarian and specifically did not include vegetarianism in the training rules in the early Sangha. He did, however, believe that we should avoid eating meat that we believe was killed specifically for us. So the question is, does that kind of interpretation work for you? Does it not? Part of your own practice. Another related question has to do, let's say, with infestations of bugs that we might have in our kitchen or perhaps in our walls that are eating the wood in our house. How do we deal with those? One of my teachers was a leader of a retreat center, and they had that issue. And many people in the retreat center really didn't know what to do because their ordinary Buddhist attempts to be kind and compassionate to these bugs simply didn't work. It was a major infestation. And this leader of this retreat center finally had to say that he would take on the karmic baggage of exterminating these bugs because they simply made the kitchen unhealthy to use. This is an example. Some will say that it's not right to kill insects, but that, let's say, using antibiotics to kill bacteria is perfectly fine. Others will say that, if insects become unhealthy to us, again, if they're in a kitchen or if they're perhaps destroying our house, that's one thing, but if they're not, that's a separate thing. All of this, again, is going to be up to our interpretation of how we understand it. And there are similar difficult questions around killing when it involves abortion or euthanasia. Now, the Buddha himself never discusses abortion per se. I did discuss a little bit of it in a video I did in the past on vagueness, and I'll leave a link to that down below in the notes. However, the Buddha did discuss euthanasia on several occasions, and they're really quite interesting discussions. The Buddha seems to have been, we might say, even surprisingly amenable to it in certain limited circumstances. Once again, I did a video on that as well. I'll leave a link to that down below if you want to hear more about that. One overarching question comes up, I think, here, which is whether it's possible to kill with compassion. And many of us might say that it simply isn't. However, one early Mahayana sutra from around the 1st century before the Common Era argues that it is possible to do this. This is the Sutra on Skill in Means. In this sutra, the Buddha appears in a past life as the captain of a ship. His name is Great Compassionate. And on this ship there are 500 wealthy merchants and one robber intent on murdering these 500 merchants and taking all of their wealth. The captain of the ship, this man named Great Compassionate, is aware of this, and also aware that the only way that he's going to be able to stop this murderer from achieving his aims is to kill him himself. So he decides that even if killing this murderer, or this potential murderer, would send him to hell, that he, the captain, is going to kill the murderer before the murderer is able to kill all these 500 merchants and take their wealth. And he does this. He kills this murderer and so saves the 500 merchants. And although it's the captain says that he's willing to undertake the pains of hell to do this, it's pretty clear from the context that this is an example of acting out of compassion, pure compassion, and so presumably his karma is good, having done this act. Now, of course, the question comes, what do you think of this? How does this appear to you? Does it seem to you that this is a reasonable kind of case, that we can kill with compassion? There's a problem here. Of course, this is sort of a slippery slope. I mean, we can think of almost any murder or killing as at least somewhat compassionate in the sense that the person who did it presumably thought they had a good reason to. But that gets us too far, clearly, plainly. On the other hand, it does sort of seem as though perhaps this captain did the right thing in saving 500 people. It's definitely a difficult and tough issue to come to terms with. And it also shows that an apparently simple practice like don't kill actually has a lot of complexity and nuance in it, even from within a Buddhist context. Now, the next two aspects of right action I'm not going to deal with in quite as much detail. There are similar nuances with both. When it comes to stealing, for example, we might say, well, it's pretty obvious we're not supposed to take something that's not offered freely or that's not given to us. However, we might wonder about the case where we walk out of a bank with the bank's pen in our hands. Is that stealing? Or if we take home material from our job, perhaps paper or pens, small things that just sort of end up in our house from our job. Is that stealing? Or perhaps we might ask about taking an egg from a chicken or a fruit from a tree. Is that stealing or not? All of these are questions that we have to practice with and come to terms with mindfully in our lives to decide what we think counts and what we think doesn't. When it comes to sexual misconduct, there's a big difference between how that's interpreted in a monastic and versus a lay context. In a monastic context, any sexual activity was sexual misconduct. Monastics are supposed to remain celibate. That's one of the significant distinctions, at least in the early Sangha, between monastics and lay people. However, for lay people, at least in the early texts, this is sexual misconduct is framed, I would say, very narrowly as something where men are not supposed to have sex with women who are in what's called a protected state, or understood to be a protected state. That is to say, if women are under the protection of their parents, under the protection of their spouses, or under the protection of the Sangha. However, I think nowadays we have a broader and a somewhat, I would say, wiser interpretation of this, where the idea is that sexual misconduct involves essentially the idea of consent. Does the other person consent? And also, in general, the idea of harm. Sexual misconduct is sexual activity that harms another person, whereas sexual activity that does not harm anybody is not misconduct. And I think if we understand right action as avoiding harm generally, then it becomes a bigger topic than simply avoiding killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct, important though those are. And we might wonder if there are other ways that we act harmfully. For example, do we act in ways that are harmful to the biosphere, to the environment around us? This is something that it was less apparent during the Buddha's day, where things were much simpler and much smaller scale, but have become important nowadays. Now, virtually anything we do is going to be harmful somewhere, somehow. Even breathing out is harmful in a certain way and adding to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But what we have to work with for the Buddha is our intentions, the character of our intentions. That's the heart of our practice. And so what we want to do, perhaps, we may consider, is to work in ways that inform our intentions, by understanding ways that we could act that is less harmful, perhaps, and understand ways in which our actions become harmful so that we can reduce the burden of delusion that is upon us. Understanding things in that way may help us to bend our intentions over time, to wonder if there are ways that we can change our actions so that we're behaving less harmfully. We may also wonder if there are positive actions that we can take to help the world, perhaps acting in ways politically to help things forward, perhaps donating to worthy people or worthy causes, perhaps acting in other ways that are generous. Now, for the Buddha, in general, ethics was framed in negative terms. That is to say, the Buddha was most interested in our avoidance of things that caused harm, in our avoidance of the bad, as it were, of the unskillful. When it came to positive actions, good actions, skillful actions, that could almost be understood as sort of the icing on the cake. Once we've avoided all the bad ones, we're really, that sort of encompasses the scope of ethics. But when we act beneficially, that's helping on top of our ethical norms and adding to them. So, for example, when any generous act we do is beneficial for the Buddha. And so finding ways to be generous in our ideas and our thoughts, with our wealth, with our time, is all beneficial. And we might consider right action, when we're thinking of the issue of right action, ways that we can expand upon that by being generous as well as by avoiding harm. In my next video, I'll talk about right livelihood, the next stage along the Eightfold Path. When that video's ready, I'll put it up here on the screen. Meanwhile, if you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked up here on the screen and down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that I'm doing here. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.